Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
ScreamingBox Technology and Business Rundown.
Welcome to the ScreamingBox Business Technology and Rundown podcast. This is a monthly podcast. If you don't want to miss our podcast, please subscribe using whichever platform you're currently listening or watching this on, so you don't miss us each month. And now to kind of begin the rundown. So we're going to be talking about remote communication, remote development, remote technologies, everything involving remote since our glorious pandemic. It's kind of forced everybody into that mode. And so there's probably lots to talk about with our hosts, Kenlin and Botan. So anybody want to start with anything or any thoughts on anything concerning remote, say, development or communications? All right. That was a great conversation. Now we can move on to the next subject.
One thing that comes to mind is just the constraints that we've got, which is being in this in Zoom or in these virtual environments where we can't get a lot of the nonverbals, or serendipity doesn't happen as much. Where those you run into somebody in the hallway and you remember something, and I think that there could be like a loss of creativity because of like being in Zoom or in these remote environments that we just can't quite replicate in person. I mean, I don't know. What do you think? Would you say something different? What do you...
I think one of the main problems with remote work is that it's a two-dimensional kind of situation, and people are 3 and 4 dimensions, right? And
Mhm.
so with remote communication and remote working, you're only able to talk and kind of say some things on video. It's very different than meeting somebody in an office, right? There's a productivity issue, but there's also a personality issue. And as you mentioned, Kenlin, this serendipity, you're just kind of having a conversation, and maybe some guy, you can read a lot into body gestures, but when all you see is a head, you don't see as much, and it doesn't allow you to communicate fully. So that I think that's a major issue in remote communications and remote work. I think companies are seeing this. They indicate in a lot of the surveys that are done that remote work has productivity has kind of taken a hit. They're not really doing a survey on creativity, so they haven't really measured if creativity has taken a hit. But companies are definitely seeing that productivity is less because it's much harder to get a group of people together to brainstorm or to do things, and everything has to be scheduled. And people are living their lives on a conference call schedule, which is a little bit different than working in an office where you can just randomly, as you feel like it, get up and walk over to the other person's desk and say, hey, Bob, what do you think of cats with 3 legs? And you can have a conversation, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's a challenge that remote work is showing. Yeah, I mean, the pandemic really hit. I mean, all this remote work. I mean, as a company, we've always done remote work. That's kind of how we built the company. But most people do not. And I read somewhere, I think it was in Vox or something, the pandemic basically put half of the US workforce into their homes, right? So, and that was done in a very short period of time when before the pandemic, remote work was like 10% of the workforce. Now it's like 50-60%, and they'll go back, but it's going to be higher. The people who stay at home, they're predicting it might be 30% of the workforce is now working remote instead of 10, right? Or maybe even more. It really depends, but I think the companies are really trying to figure out how to do this, and they talk about this hybrid model where people work from home and they come into the office 2 or 3 times a week and work from the office, or some of the people work from home and the rest of the people work in the office. It's going to be very interesting. A lot of it has to do with the people. So I've always worked remotely. I like kind of being alone in my office at home, and I'm very comfortable with that. My wife, on the other hand, she loves working in an office, and she's very social, and she wants to talk to other people, and she gets a lot done by doing that. So her working at home has been actually a little bit more stressful because she doesn't have those social interactions, right? And so some people want to go back to the office. They can't wait. And some people enjoyed working from home and wouldn't go back to the office because they liked it better, right? So I think it's going to be an interesting mix in the future.
It's also a steep learning curve to like learn to socialize remotely because we take it for granted. When we're in person, we can just talk to each other, like you mentioned previously. We can just go up to someone and say that, "Hey, I'm working on this. What do you think?" But remotely, it takes a lot more effort to stay connected, to keep a schedule on who to reach out to and when. And it's really simple to, it's really easy to lose those connections. It actually takes a lot more effort to keep up with coworkers and sort of, even just ask them like how they doing every day.
This is a lot more work. So I've been working remotely, I guess, for about 5 years now, actually pre-pandemic. And the thing that seemed to has helped me the most is having to put a thing like virtual coffees on my calendar. So I try to meet different people um, just intentionally. But yeah, there's no like running into somebody. The second best thing I've seen so far is in Slack. Like there's like a question of the day where you can learn about your coworkers there. But again, there has to be a lot of thought put into getting to know people rather than just being able to run into people.
Yeah, the social aspects of having to actually meet people and be concerned about their personal lives and all that. It can be exhausting, especially when you're on your seventh Zoom call of the day,
Hmm.
and it's just like, okay, I haven't left my chair in 8 hours. It would be nice if I could like move around or something. It sometimes gets a little difficult in that sense,
Hmm.
but we will see how it progresses in the future. But I agree, for those who have been doing remote work for a long time, they know that there's kind of a tempo of the work. Whereas I think people in an office were used to a very different tempo, and now that teams are getting, distributed and spread out, so example, some of these large companies, their workers, since they're all going to be working from home, have moved, right? A lot of them are actually moving, like in California, they're moving to states with much lower cost of living, and the companies are realizing this, and so now the teams are more distributed, and so it can be, a question: do we pay them the same? The time
Hmm.
zones are different now. They got to schedule calls at weird hours. Um, you know, people are working. If I want to talk to someone in Asia, I'm working late at night, and then there's Europe, so then you're working early in the morning, and so I think the companies are finding that this kind of time zone scheduling and distribution of employees is making it harder. Where it was much easier if they're all in one building in one location. Communication is much faster, and the tempo of work is much faster because you don't have all these differences in time zones and other things.
What do you think is the most stretch we can give between time zones? Like, how many hours of difference would you say is still? I don't want to say ideal, but acceptable when we are working remotely. Because I have seen that usually remote work opportunities often include that, for example, you can only take this job if you live in the States or if you live in Europe or Asia or whatever.
That, 12 hours is the reality. So you can do phone calls to one side of the planet in the morning, and you can do phone calls to your
Hmm.
local area during the day, and then you can do calls late at night to the other side of the planet, right?
Yeah.
So it really depends.
And
Yeah, I
sometimes
mean,
you
this,
can't get out of it. Like this one time I had to show up for a presentation at 4:30 in the morning Pacific time because it was the management was over in Denmark. So it was
Yeah.
like there's no way to get out of it. You just have to show up for your slot and present. So
Yeah,
uh,
I have I'm doing a conference and leading a panel for a European investment group, and there's no way around it. I have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, uh, have become conscious, run the panel, and then go back to sleep. And there's no way around it. That's just what the schedule is, right? And I think workers and people are starting to realize that yeah, for certain jobs and other things, the remote situation is great for them, and they can work a normal kind of 8 hour day. But for other people, and particularly people who are running businesses, they tend to have to work really long days, and for me, I'm working all the time, right? One of my more productive work times is just before I go to bed at 11 o'clock at night, right? Because I can get a lot of emails and stuff done, and a lot of the people I'm working with are in Europe, and so when they're starting their day, they're getting my emails. So I work, I usually do an hour of email before I go to sleep, and then when I wake up in the morning, I got a whole bunch of emails I got to answer before I do my first phone calls. So it's a long day, right? And I break it up,
jeez.
and that's kind of the advantage of working from home is you can break up your day and you can schedule stuff that makes sense for you. So I usually like to try to get in a bike ride during the day, and the best time for that seems to be my 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And phone call wise and time zone wise, that's an empty spot for me. So it works out, and I can do that 3 or 4 times a week, which kind of keeps me sane. Whereas if I was working in an office, it's not so much.
yeah, that's a great topic. I mean, exercise. It's extremely important for not losing our minds. Like recently, I just started walking on a treadmill instead of having lunch. And it has an incredibly positive effect on my mental health. And I think that's something to consider. Like when we think about equipment for remote work, what do we think of? Webcams, microphones, headsets. That's about it. Usually a laptop does it all in one package. But what we don't think of is people need to do some exercise. Like, I mean, biking is a great option for sure. Even if you are biking at home on an exercise bike, it's absolutely awesome. But that is something we rarely think about. And actually, I've only ever seen a single uh, job posting where they said that, okay, here's your allowance of, I don't know, 5,000 euros in that range somewhere, and go buy some exercise equipment because you're going to lose your sanity working remotely if you don't exercise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we need that perk.
For
Yeah,
sure.
I think companies are learning this too. If they're going to ask their workers to work these long hours over a long or a lot of hours over a long period of time, they got to encounter a lifestyle, right? And the, there is aspects of that, like my wife has to schedule her day because she takes my daughter to daycare. So she has to schedule her calls so that she doesn't have a call during one particular hour, so she can do that. But that works out. But she's also taking calls at 7 or 8 at night because she has to talk to China, right? And so, I think the companies are now really accepting this kind of flexible timeline of work, where work is done, or there's times when you're not working during the day. Whereas in the past, if you were working in an office, that was unacceptable, right? And I think these companies are starting to see that it has real benefits. I don't know if they're promoting exercise as much, but clearly exercise is really important. Even just getting up and moving around. I do a lot of my calls without video because I like to walk around and wave my arms, and sometimes I just go up and down the stairs 10 times for some exercise, and I have my headset on and people are talking so I can listen and move around, and that helps keep me sane a little bit, right? But if you're on video, you just got to sit in front of the camera the whole time, kind of like making a podcast or something like that.
And this is really funny because I mean, on the project that I'm working on, we never do video calls ever. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just
so you guys
sort of
out walking?
part of the culture.
Yeah, well, here's something that kind of relative to the subject, something my normal kind of humor. So, how many software developers does it take to change a light bulb?
How many?
None. That's a hardware problem.
All right. You just
All right.
submit a ticket.
Yeah. I just had to do at least one bad joke podcast, so I thought I'd try that one. That brings up a different subject. So there are jobs that need some kind of physical location because they involve, example, a hardware developer may not have access to technology they need to develop their engineering. They could do a bunch of their engineering at home, but they may need access to tools and location. And so with remote work, that may be an issue. One of the things I read was that there are businesses starting that are providing tools and locations and laboratories for people who are doing work remotely, that they can kind of come in and rent it for a day or half a day to do work. And that because they've moved and they're now remote, and they need access to those tools, but they can't fly into their headquarters of their company a couple states over or something. Um, but what do you think about these people who actually kind of as a remote worker will need access to that? How do they deal with that, or what are things that they're going to have to try to figure out?
You're saying if they don't have a resource like that
Yeah,
available.
if
Wow.
you work with a company and you decide to move to another state because the cost is lower, but you still work for the company, but then the company needs you to do some things that require some tools or whatever, and flying a couple states over to do that for a couple hours doesn't make sense. What do these people do? Do they try to build a laboratory in their house, or do they rent a laboratory, or find the tools? Maybe the companies have to buy the tools, and maybe some of them are big and some of them are small. I mean, that's a challenge that remote work is going to bring up or has brought up, right?
It could. I mean, if like, what is the cost of travel for them to go into the place if it's going to be less to just buy things or buy the equipment they need and send it to them? Then maybe that
Yeah,
could make sense rather than having them travel. That is, I think a lot of companies are finding that work travel is not necessary as much as they thought. Like there's actually this has been like this giant experiment where they get to have their beliefs challenged. So I think it could be that people are shipping equipment out where they wouldn't have otherwise just spent
hmm
money on hotels and food and travel.
Yeah, that's fair. But I mean, let's consider the part when they are on payroll. And let's go back to the example where we mentioned the lab. So if you want a good like chemistry lab, how many business class tickets does it take to build up a proper lab
Mhm.
for any kind of serious work? I mean, it's got to be a lot. So
It is a
I would
lot.
say in some cases, travel is completely justified and justifiable, rightfully. Oh, right. I mean, it's even cheaper to buy a private plane. You can buy a Cessna for, I think, for less than electron microscope. So, I mean, those are some new considerations that no employer ever
Mhm.
thought of before.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that companies have to deal with, I mean, there was a study by McKinsey, and they basically analyzed over 2,000 different type of jobs and 800 occupations in about 8 different countries, like in Europe and United States. And they're only really considering remote work that can be done without a loss of productivity, right? And what they showed is that 20 to 25% of the workforces can actually work from home 3 to 5 days a week without having a loss of productivity or limits of the job, right? So, what they're expecting and what they're predicting from this is that, the remote workforce will grow up to, probably 25-30% of the workforce will now be remote. That's going to leave a lot of empty office space. But it's also going to, if they built a laboratory or a testing facility or something, and they were expecting, 100 workers to use it all the time, now it's only going to be 50 workers using it all the time. It may not be that productive or efficient, and they may have overbuilt for what they're actually going to have, or they weren't considering the cost of having to fly those people in all the time to use that facility. Um, I think that's going to be a very big challenge that some of the larger enterprise companies are going to be dealing with, right?
Yeah. Well, how about San Francisco, the Salesforce tower, and then Salesforce then announces that everyone can work from home. So, it's like, what are they going to do with that giant tower?
Yeah, that was huge. That was like what 100 stories,
Yeah, it's huge.
and it's been empty now. I mean, I don't know. They spent what I don't know how many, 200-300 million dollars to build that thing. Now it's kind of empty. But I also think, I don't know about San Francisco, but much of the country, at least the United States, they're predicting that, during the pandemic, about 50% of the workforce was working remote, right? So it went from 10% to 50%, and they think it's going to go back down to 30%. But that's still, 20% of the workforce isn't going back to the office that used
Mhm.
to go to an office. That's a quarter or close to a quarter. What are all those people going to do with those empty buildings, right? Um, I know some people who work for a large company that has a campus with like 10 buildings on it, and they would have 8,000 people working on site all the time. And now they're thinking of having maybe 4,000 people working on site. So they got, huge buildings that are basically going to be empty. You know, who are they going to sell them to? Because not a lot of people need empty buildings because their workforces aren't all working in an office, right? Um, and another person I know, um, their office was renovated to be this office of the future where everybody works together in one place and they're all compact and they're sharing desks and all that other stuff. Well,
Mhm.
now in this post-pandemic world, they have to convert that office back into an old style office with cubicles and people are isolated. Um, and there are a bunch of people who don't want to go back to that, right? So there's some really big
Ironic.
challenges.
I think among developers too, because now with so many companies now offering remote work, I've heard talk of people not wanting to go back to a place that requires them to be in an office. They want the flexibility. So I feel like it's could end up being a competitive advantage for companies as far as hiring. Like they need to offer remote work, or else they might lose some of their best workers.
Well, I think another issue is, as a lot of companies they already know they're going to have this kind of what I would call hybrid mix. right? Where they have employees that work remotely, they have employees that work on site, they have employees that work half remote, half on site. One of the things I read was that a lot of promotions and career development during the pandemic, a lot of it stopped. And one of the reasons they cited for it is that a lot of those events take place in person. And people who are on site working with the management and the directors who are on site will have a better opportunity at advancing their career than the remote people who never come on site and never meet the management in person. I don't know. What do you guys think? Is that a valid concern? Is that something that you think will be happening?
I think it's
Mm.
valid. But, as far as like having FaceTime with people, it's like you don't get to know, like, you remember that term, putting a face to a name. It's like you're allowing yourself to be present and people to put your face to that name, and I think that's more of a powerful visual for people. Even if they're intending to promote remote people, I think having people in front of you makes a big difference.
We can also flip this on its head and just say that, you know, people who are remote are less annoying, so they may have more opportunities. So I'm sure everyone on this podcast had their share of annoying coworkers, and they are much more annoying in person.
Hmm.
That can be guaranteed.
Yeah.
uh, I don't know. There's definitely a shift. There's definitely
Hmm.
a much larger emphasis on corporate events. Like, I mean, after the pandemic, because right now, obviously, everything is cancelled, everything is postponed. But since most of us are working remotely anyway, or all of us are, uh, we probably are in a good place to understand that FaceTime does not necessarily mean being in the office.
Hmm.
It can also mean just showing up for events, being well dressed, well groomed in
Hmm.
those situations. That way, we can leave a lasting impression on people.
Yeah,
And in the
that's
office,
true.
after the first couple months, like maybe we stop wearing a suit jacket or just forget to put our handkerchiefs in our pockets. Little stuff like that. We start to and tend to let go after a while. So there's something to be said for being always presentable when
Hmm.
we meet
Yeah.
executives, CTOs, CEOs, and such.
Hmm. Absolutely. For myself, I was able to advance remotely. Um, but at the same time, like being in a hybrid environment where you had most of most everybody was in the office, and then there was only like a group of us that were remote. I feel like it's harder to be visible if most people are working in person. So I think that's when it takes a lot more effort to put yourself out there. Like you said, I think yeah, it's absolutely possible, but how do you make yourself visible if most people are not remote? Like, what do you think?
I mean, advancement is an interesting topic because it's also a generational thing. So
Hmm.
there's been many studies on this, and millennials and up, they usually see advancement as quitting a certain
Hmm.
position at a certain job and going to another one. And it's certainly much more easy to advance this way because
It's
we can
true.
just write in our resume that okay, I had 2+ years of experience at this place doing this thing, so hire me at a position befitting of my
Hmm.
experience. So I honestly, in my generation, I haven't really seen anyone advance at their positions. I don't know if that's a social thing or it's
Interesting.
I really have no idea, but in the same position, I've never seen anyone advance. That's something weird. You know, about advancement, it's always a strange topic to me because
Hmm.
I used to work at corporates, like a huge multinational corporation, and every year they would do a pay raise based on evaluations given at the end of the year by supervisors. And the thing was that that pay raise didn't even cover inflation. So what's the point? Like,
Yeah.
why wouldn't anyone just quit and find another position? And the funny thing is, when I exited that corporation, they kept calling me for an entire year for some reason. Like, hey, we have this and this job opening. And I'm like, guys, why?
Yeah. And I also think it's with different types of people within a company, right?
Mm,
So, the I guess you would say the worker bees, they're not really looking for lots of promotions, or they don't expect a lot of promotions. But all the managers and all the directors, their only question is, when do I get to become a director? When do I get to become a
right.
senior vice president? They're looking for their next career move. But usually in these companies, those higher directors, they don't have a whole lot of places to move to, because once you're director or senior vice president, it's kind of hard to move up in the company, right? But the middle management, managers and senior managers and those type of people, yeah, they're expecting to move up. They would like to move up, and that's
Mm,
part of this career drive. And within technology companies, you know, the companies know that if they want to keep their people, they have to provide some kind of way for them to be promoted or to move up. At the same time, if the organization isn't, a 2,000 or 3,000 person organization, and you're working in a company with only 100 people, how many times can you move up, right? There's just not that many places to move up at.
I mean, as many
But
times as you want. You just get a new title and a slight pay raise. I
yeah,
mean,
right.
uh,
Uh,
like,
a lot of companies now are just not even giving title changes. They're just giving pay raises, saying, "Look, we
oh,
can't move you up, but we'll pay you more money. Please stay happy."
huh.
Um,
Well, that's better
and
than,
some
I
of the
guess.
benefits of remote work, that they're now offering that. They're saying, "Well, you'll get to work remote." Um, but the companies are also realizing stuff like a bunch of people are like, especially in say California where I am, they're basically saying, well, if I'm going to work remote, I'm going to move to Florida because the cost of living is half of California. And the companies are like, oh, okay, move to Florida. We're going to renegotiate your salary. You don't need as much money because you don't have a huge mortgage, a California mortgage. You now have a Florida mortgage. So we're going to pay you less, right? And that's
Oh,
actually
nice.
starting to happen. That these people are moving, thinking that they're going to get California pay in Florida, and the
Mhm.
companies are saying, no, no, no. We would like to see the cost savings too, right?
Yeah, that's the thing with remotes. Like, even if we go to a company that operates in California, they are like, okay, but you live in the EU, one of the cheapest countries in the EU, so you're going to get the lowest pay in the company. So it's fun. And also, like, country of origin, I feel matters a bit. Like, not so much, because we are so invested in diversity and supporting diversity that it's getting to be less and less of an issue. But I have noticed that, I mean, in Europe especially, like, you got the east side and the west side, sort of. And
Uh-huh.
on the
Yeah.
east side, let's say you get paid 1,000 shekels, while on the west side you get paid 10,000. And if you take a job on the west side, but you're from the east side, you're gonna get paid, I mean, maybe 2,000, 3,000, something like that.
Hmm.
And it's just baffling to me. Like, how did this become normal? Like, how
Yeah,
is
the
this?
same work, right?
Yeah,
If you're doing the same work, then it should
yeah. And
be
often you
same.
do more work because you are from a lower income area, so you feel like you have to prove yourself. So some of the hardest working people are from, like, the Near East. I don't know what
Uh-huh.
is the right expression. Like, but some of the best guys are from those regions because they feel this immense motivation to prove themselves.
Yeah, no, it is a real question about pay rates and same work for different rate. And yeah, there is a reality. If they and it's more of a reality with in-house or with local development or local work, right? But even these companies are like, they. I think that a lot of companies, a year, 2, 3 years after the pandemic, they're going to realize that the productivity and the way they want to do business, they're going to want their employees to spend time in the offices. Um, and so, yes, there'll still be a lot of remote workers, but I don't think it'll be at the level people are thinking now. I think the companies want to have their workers closer. And in that situation, cost of living in the local area does mean something. Um,
Yeah.
but
It's also an ego thing. Like for middle
no, it
management, it's a
is.
huge
Yeah,
ego thing to have everyone working at their desks in
right.
clearly visible,
Hmm.
There's that as well. And, the world is, yes, I think that pay rates are going to get a little bit closer. And countries that were working in lower pay rates, those people are going to get higher pay rates as remote workers, particularly when they are working in a freelance kind of situation. When they're working as a company employee, it might be different because part of that is other benefits that you get as an employee that you wouldn't get as, say, a freelancer, and companies are going to leverage that. But I think the world's definitely going to go through a change with remote work, that the rates are going to kind of not have as much of a difference, that gap between a worker doing one job in one country and a worker doing the same job in another country. I think the pay rates are going to get a little bit closer. I don't think they'll ever be the same globally throughout the world, but I think you'll see a little bit closing of that gap. um,
but that's a dream, ain't that right?
yeah, I see it happening now, right? So
Mm.
we do see changes in that. A lot of that is because of demand. Example for developers, there's a very high demand right now because during the pandemic, everybody realized they're going to have to do business digitally. So they need their websites working, they need their digital products working better. And so everybody's scrambling to find developers. In another year or two, those projects will all be finished, and it'll probably go back to the way it was pre pandemic when they had a lot more developers available and the rates were a little bit lower. Although I don't think the rates are going to come down that much, but developer availability will probably increase, and so people will be looking for projects. Whereas right now, there's more projects than developers, right? But it may shift to other things and other types of workers. Example right now, the hardest thing to find is restaurant workers. Where we are, they're opening up a lot of the restaurants, and the restaurant owners can't find workers. Nobody wants to work in the restaurants for what they used to pay, right?
Yeah, it
Now they
makes
want a
sense, but
lot more, and the restaurants aren't built on that business model to pay more. So
yeah,
they're having a
people
hard
who
time
work
finding
in
people.
restaurants are also one of the most abused group of people ever, like
Yeah.
by employers. So it's no wonder that they don't want to go back.